So welcome. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion hosted by York St. John University in commemoration of the International Women's Day. So I am Dr. Ernestine Gayunze, and I'm the Associate Dean for York Business School. I'm delighted to be joined on this panel tonight by Professor Gail Kaufman, who is the Nancy and Erin Madry Professor of Sociology and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Davidson College in the US. They are the author of Fixing Parental Leave and Super Dads, How Fathers Balance Work and Family in the 21st Century. We're also joined by Mr. Scott Mayer, who is a father's mental health campaigner, coming from lived experience of paternal mental health. He now works with organizations, hospitals, and charities around the country, delivering training to healthcare professionals and supporting new fathers with their mental health and transition into parenthood. So he's also campaigning for better support for all parents' mental health, along with screening. He has also set up multiple antenatal programs for fathers to help them be more involved and give the child the best possible outcome. And also delighted to be joined by Dr. Amy Beacom, who is the founder and CEO of Center for Parental Leave Leadership, and the only full-service consultancy in the United States to focus exclusively on parental leave. So in 2006, she conceived of and began creating the field of parental leave coaching in the US by developing the Retain Parental Leave Coaching Model as part of her doctoral work at the Columbia University. So Retain remains the only evidence-based and field-tested parental leave coaching program in the US. So her company provides coaching and consultancy for all sizes of organization, as well as directly to working parents. So they recently launched the Retain Coaching Certification Program to train external providers and offer support more broadly. So Amy is also the author of Parental Leave Playbook, 10 touch points to transition smoothly, strengthen your family, and continue building your career. Very welcome to all of you. Apologies from my colleague, Dr. Anjali Raj Westwood, who was supposed to join us, but unfortunately due to ill health, she can't be with us, and we wish her a speedy recovery. So we're going to start with Gael, please. So Gael, with regards to your current research on work-family balance during the pandemic, what kind of discourse is emerging in relation to this between mothers and fathers? Do they discuss differently? How similar or how differently were their experiences based on expectations related to their gender?
Yeah. Well, thank you first for having me here. This is a great panel, so I'm glad to be part of it. And I'm always glad to be talking about these issues surrounding gender equality and balancing work and family. So just a little bit of background. I am currently working on a research project that looks at work and family during the pandemic. This is part of a 7-country study that was started by members of the Leave Network, who focus on parental leave, and also wanted to understand sort of experiences during the pandemic of what was going on. Of course, when we started planning it, we didn't know how long things would last or what would happen. And so we were able to conduct a survey last summer of 2021. So right, I don't know if it's the middle or just the beginning yet of this pandemic, but it was focused specifically on parents. And so today I'll just mention the bit that focuses on the US parents with children under 12 years old. And we asked them a series of questions about how they divided housework, things like cooking and cleaning and laundry, and also how they divided childcare, like physical care of children, reading, helping with homework, and so forth. And we asked these questions sort of in this pattern where we asked about before COVID, directing them to think about, you know, a month or two before, say, for the US, it would have been February of 2020, and then to answer in regard to what was currently happening for them. And so we can sort of compare and see whether people are with partners are sharing more or less, right? So overall, the pattern seems to be that individuals are saying that they and their partners are sharing more in terms of both housework and childcare. And so just in general, they're more likely to respond that they're sharing equally in these various tasks as opposed to themselves doing more, their partners doing more. But interestingly, and this is something that I think was found before the pandemic, is that men are more likely to indicate that they're sharing equally than women. So they're not, now we don't have people who are partnered with each other, but it's just, I think, something that has been noticed in other research, that when men and women are asked about how they share housework and childcare, men are more likely to say that it's equal. We were also able to compare those who have same-sex partners versus different sex partners, and there are some interesting patterns there, indicating that those with same-sex partners were more likely to increase their sharing over the pandemic compared to those in different sex couples. And interestingly, if you just look at sort of the heart of the pandemic in June of 2021, you have a situation where anywhere from a quarter to a third of women in different sex relationships and men in same-sex couples say that they're sharing housework equally. And the percentages are higher for men in different sex couples and women in same-sex couples. So there are some interesting things that we'd like to look at more closely. But one last thing that was really interesting is that men in same-sex relationships are the ones that have the most even split across the different categories. So in other words, if they're not sharing equally, they're the most likely to have similar percent saying, I do more and my partner does more, right? Compared to like women, whether they're in different sex or same sex, are saying they do more, and men in different sex relationships say their partners do more, right? So it's interesting to look at that and see that there could be some interesting gender dynamics happening in these different relationships. But overall, I don't want to talk too long, but overall, I think there is some sense of like spending more time at home and being more engaged, and trying to make an effort to share with one's partner. But you know, there are still a lot of differences that are occurring, so we might get into those more later.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting, isn't it? Hearing some of the men saying, oh, we're sharing, I'm doing more, or we're doing equally, and so on. So the interesting thing is that because of the pandemic, and is that something that potentially can carry on like that, or is that something that just happened as a result of the pandemic and probably will revert to the pre-pandemic. I think it's an interesting scenario and an interesting study to know what, because the key thing here is, like you said, there is that sign that there is more drive towards gender equality. So is there a serious lesson we can pick up from there and hone in on and make sure that it continues? But thank you so much. Picking up and following up on that, Amy. So in your previous interviews and podcasts that you've done, you've discussed how parental leave policies should be recognized as a systematic problem, targeting companies and employers rather than placing the onus on individual parents or mothers. So meanwhile, it's often a parent who will reach out for support or guidance on this matter. So how can you discuss, or what would you say is the reason why you encourage parents to take control in their parental leave due to the lack of consistency in paid leave policies across the US?
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to answer that. I'm also still thinking about what Gail was saying. So I have so much I want to say there. I just, for your listeners or viewers, in case they don't know, the United States is the only country, the only wealthy country to not have any federal paid leave policy at all. So we have 9 states plus DC that have a paid leave policy. They're all different across those states, and all the rest of the 50 plus states do not have any policy at all for paid leave. And so what that means is people within our country are cobbling together some sort of minuscule leave if they're able to do it at all. We have 25% of our population who goes back to work within 2 weeks of giving birth. So it's a really different situation here than it is in the UK. And I think Dr. Kaufman has a lot more that she could add to that. But I just want your viewers, I'm not sure how this is going out, to really understand that difference. But then to your question, here, especially in the US, it is such a systemic problem with the lack of a standard policy that we are all actively working to make that happen, but it could be years. We had a little moment of hope with the Build Back Better Act that we would have a federal policy at 12 weeks paid leave. That does not look like it is going to be happening. So we are back to where we've been for 30 years. Well, forever, but 30 years since our Family Medical Leave Act was passed. So we are actively working on that, but in the meantime, individuals are suffering. New parents, that's not going to get to them in time. And so our work is really making sure that we go in usually to a client company organization and hired by them to look at how, usually often first for policy, like what are we doing with our policy? How can it be improved? They might expand on one they have to make it more gender neutral, or to expand the time frame, or to increase the rate of pay reimbursement. But beyond that, what my work started focusing on the US 15 years ago was, how do we create a process that is shared and there's a common language between the management and the organization and that new parent going on leave, so that we have something that is replicable, it is easily understood, everyone's doing the same thing, it is not reinventing the wheel each time. And so while I do say, yes, we want to focus on that new parent, it's only because these other parents aren't going to get there in time. So I could talk about this forever, but happy to answer any more questions, follow-up questions on that.
Thank you, Emmett. Really interesting, isn't it? Because when we start to then draw on comparisons between countries and then thinking about what we've got and thinking about the fact that this is International Women's Day, so there's bound to be comparisons between jurisdictions and so on. So like in the UK, yes, we do have a policy, but then there's still a push for employers to do much more than what
Yes.
the government has
Yes.
provided as a basic, isn't it?
Yes. And I
which
think,
is very different to the US.
Yeah, I'm so excited you said that. Sorry to talk over you. Because what you're pointing out is the difference between policy and practice and how important that distinction is. So much of what needs to happen is policy-based. That's going to hit the most broad number of people in all levels of our economy. But what happens at the individual level is the practice. And so my work as an organizational psychologist and an anthropologist and a gender, all of the different things that have brought me to where I am, is really intrigued, fascinated, obsessed with the practice pieces of it. How can we create those processes that I was just talking about? And so what I write about in my book is these 10 touch points of transition. And what those are the things that we've seen both in our work in Australia and our work in the US over the last 8 years, that everyone navigates through, no matter what their policy is, who they are, what their job role is, all of those things aside, what they interact with throughout that, what we call the parental leave transition, which is really that in the US, it's roughly 9 months to a year of preparing for leave, during leave, and returning from leave, and that reintegration back into work. And that starts with the announcement. So there's 10 different things. Everyone has to announce what it is and how they consider and how they do that and how they lead that and set the tone are all different things to think about. But on the company level or the organizational level, how that manager responds to that announcement, how HR responds to that announcement is their work to be done. And so everything that we do since day one has been around creating this aligned conversation, language, and process between manager and HR and that new parent. So we work on training the managers in their side of each of those touch points and supporting the parents in their side of each of those.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you. The area around the employer, so the line manager, the HR, and how they communicate with the parents is a crucial one. Thank you. Just to follow that up and turning to Scott, please. So, Scott, with this, because if you gather from what Gail and Amy have said so far, we know that the whole issue of gender stereotype is outdated now, and men who were first or most of the time looked at as breadwinners are becoming more and more engaged, more and more, like Gail was saying, about the sharing of that responsibility at home. So with the outdated stereotype that men should serve as family protectors still prevailing in this society because it's still there, how did this influence and the perceived role and expectation of a father in the home during the pandemic? Now, did you feel a duty to protect your family from the virus and to support in terms of everything that was going on? How did this change your responsibility as a father to your children and also as a figure of support to your partner?
Thank you. I'll break that down. The first part I'll talk about is what I think has happened. I've been a parent for 19 years. I'll get this out the way quick. I've got 7 boys. My eldest is 19. My youngest is 3. And I normally get 2 follow-up questions and I'll answer them in advance. Yes, we do have a telly, and no, we're not having any more. And what I sort of realized along the way is in that 19, so if we call it 20 years, the role of a father has changed massively. The problem that we have is society did not keep up with that change. And in the last 2 years, the pandemic has expedited that even more. And I think the conversations that we're having around parenting, paternity leave, involvement, engagement, from my point of view, working in the sort of mental health area of new parents, we have this long-term plan as part of the NHS plan to engage better with fathers. But predominantly, if the mother is going through the perinatal mental health team, now fathers will be screened. So because of that, there's a big emphasis on what fathers do and what they can do, and trying to have different conversations. And what we've found now that we are sort of transitioning back into the workplace, we're starting to see just how much that role of a father has changed and the demands that are put on the fathers. And some of the work that I do is if the mother is in what we call a mother and baby unit, so if they're experiencing severe mental illness, and sometimes the baby will obviously go, but if there's not space, then they just go to like a mental health or a psychiatric ward, and the babies can't always go. So you have a primary caregiver in the father that is now trying to deal with things that is completely alien, a service that struggles to engage with, and they're the sole carer of this baby. And that puts a different dynamic and a different pressure on that I think we're now starting to take into account. And if both parents or one parent is experiencing problems with their mental health, it has an impact on the other one. And that in turn has an impact on the family. And when I say that, people sometimes get a little bit upset with me. I'm not criticizing parenting because I've experienced bad mental health, and so has my wife. And I'm not saying that it has a massive lasting impact on our children, but it has an impact of such, because when you're not at your best, you can't give your best. And I think during the pandemic, we've definitely seen a different side of that, because we had to maybe navigate and have conversations we maybe didn't have with our children before. So I think it has changed the emphasis. I think we changed our priorities a little bit. And what I definitely found with a lot of fathers that maybe have had a baby in the pandemic but had older children as well, is that by working from home and not having that commute, that gave them family time that they didn't have before. So all of a sudden they've got an extra few hours a day, so they can break that down. They've got half an hour to work out or whatever it is they do for themselves. You know, they've got a little bit of time to play with the children, engage with the children, and then still time to unwind as a couple. And it just created that healthier work-life balance. For far too long, I believe that we've looked at it that our work life and our family life don't cross over. And what happens at home stays at home, and vice versa with work. And I don't think it does. I think they definitely morph into each other. If you're struggling at home, it spills into work. If you've got a bad day at work, it spills into your home life. And particularly with our children, if we're under undue stress or pressure at work, and I often say this, that if you're punishing a child or maybe telling a child off or reacting to a certain situation, and this again isn't criticism because we all do it, that sort of 80% I think of how we react is more what we're experiencing at that time than what that child has done. And I think that what we've found is because we've been in such a close proximity as parents, the homeschool, which we were very fortunate from a personal point of view. We already home educated our children, and both my wife and I are home based anyway. So some people hate me for this, but our life didn't change that much with the restrictions and with COVID. We were very fortunate. So we already had like a family ecosystem that was in place. So it's probably unfair to say that there was a big change because my life didn't change. But what I have found is because of COVID and because of things that have happened, we're having conversations that I would like to think I always had, predominantly having sons, around about stress and mental health and what's happening. And I did become very overprotective. And the reason that I'm making this point is I wanted to protect my children from the virus, as we all did. And my youngest was born very unwell. He had underdeveloped lungs. So when we first started reading about COVID, we were very concerned if he got it, it could be very, very dangerous. And because of that, I think we instilled that fear a little bit into the rest of our boys, that they had to protect their little brother. And one of my second eldest son, he's doing his GCSEs. He does one day release through college. The rest of the time he's homeschooled. So he was always quite anxious and worried about going to college, getting the virus, bringing it back into the house, because we weren't really doing anything else. We weren't going out. We weren't socializing as much from a protective point of view. So what I've seen with other fathers, because I do a lot of peer support with dads that are traumatized through difficult births or that are experiencing problems with their mental health, and they went through very similar. And the one thing that we've definitely found that is linked to it, if it's a COVID related father, is that because they didn't have a lot of control over the situation, because of the restrictions, they maybe weren't at appointments, they didn't get to sometimes go to scans, and they had limited time at the birth and even visiting afterwards. And there was lots of different issues, and a few fathers that I've worked with that had maybe neonatal babies or babies that were unwell, maybe required surgery. There was this, they couldn't control it, they couldn't help it, they couldn't protect them. So what they can do is protect them from COVID. And it almost sent them into this overprotective, anxious state that was almost a bit like trauma. It was a bit like fight or flight. And we've seen that in quite a lot of fathers. And what we're now seeing, that I don't want to sound too doom and gloom, that we're not quite equipped. We're not equipped to deal with the fact that men struggle anyway. I just don't think any society accepts that men experience these things and that men can find times hard. And the fact that the suicide statistics now 75% of men, but in that perinatal period, that's the most high risk period of a man's life. And when it comes to suicide, it's where he's at his most risk. So we know there's intense pressure in that area anyway. Then you add a pandemic. It has changed the way that we father, because we're at home, we're more involved, we're more engaging, we've had time there. But because of that, dads are now experiencing what, yet again, very sexist. I say mums and dads, that's what I deal with. That's all I've ever dealt with in terms of family dynamics. And the dads that I've worked with, and I think that on a much larger scale that we just don't know about yet, that you have this dad guilt that we've experienced for such a long time with mums going back into the workplace. They've been at home for whatever period of time. I know in the States it's obviously up in the air a little bit, but if they've been at home for, say, a year or whatever it might be, and they're going back into work and they're leaving baby for childcare or with their mom, whatever, that leaving baby, how are they going to cope on their own? Who's going to do the afternoon feed? Who's going to give them a story when they want their nap? And they build this pressure, this separation anxiety builds in. Well, we have that now in dads on a scale that we've never had before, because we've never had this many dads at home for this period of time and then going back into the workplace. And the problem with that is because we're not talking about this, and it is International Women's Day, that if these fathers aren't supported in their mental health, that has an impact on them. It absolutely does, because I touched on it earlier on. You can't get away from it because the family dynamics dictate that one will lean on the other one and vice versa. We don't really support that enough. So now we've got all these fathers going into a workplace that don't understand this transition, this mental health. But on the flip side, from a woman's point of view, I've had 3 couples that I've worked with where mum has said to me in the last couple of months that they've got older children, they've had a baby during the pandemic, so things have changed. Her working style has changed. She goes, I've got older teenagers, and this is the first time I've ever done the school run, Scott, and it's changed my life. It's absolutely changed my life, because we now have a system that, for whatever reason, accommodates parents to be parents and have a job. And that's both parents. That's mom, that's dad and mom and mom. It doesn't matter how it works out. They've now got a chance where, yes, they can't be there for everything all of the time, and you can't give your children everything all of the time. And that's a lesson that we learn the hard way as parents, unfortunately. But the fact that we can now subsidize the fact that we can not have it all, but you can have the career and you can have the family. You don't really have to sacrifice one or the other because of this hybrid system where you've got people 3 days in the office, 2 days at home, and vice versa. My problem is one day they might take that away. I'm not sure. But for a lot of the families that I've worked with, particularly the dads, like I said, because they've now found this time they didn't have before. And they can do things with the children. They can do the homework, because I'm a firm believer, and then I'll shut up, this is my last comment, that when it comes to 50-50 parenting, very hard to achieve in every household. Obviously some can and some can't, but it's very difficult. In most households, definitely in mine and the ones that I deal with, there is more pressure on mum. There's more emphasis on mum. And you can joke about the fact that women can multitask and men can't. But my wife can do multiple things at once. If I do more than 2, that's it. I start to shut down like an old computer. And she has that ability. So there is more pressure, more demand. My children will levitate to her for certain things more. But it's teaching parents that that's not necessarily a reflection of how they parent. It's a reflection of their child knows what they need, and they levitate to the person that can give it to them. And it's just giving them the tools to do that, and accept that we can't be there and we can't be everything that they need us to be, but we can talk to them about it. And by having those conversations with our children and the next generation of parents, we change the narrative a little bit. And if we put pathways in place to support all parents and let dad stay at home and mom go to work and support that, or vice versa, and stop everybody having an opinion on how you should parent, if we start to put that in place on a bigger scale, the next generation of parents won't experience the rates. I mean, 1 in 5 moms, 1 in 10 dads will experience postnatal depression. Statistically, that's people that are engaging with statistics. When you think that most parents aren't really asked about their mental health, you shorten that window. So, for example, lots of polls have said 90% of dads weren't asked about their mental health. So you're only dealing with 10%. So out of that 10%, you've still got a 1 in 10 statistic. So it just shows you how high that number actually is. And the reason for that is they don't really necessarily get the support. And if they don't get the support, they can't support their partner. And if they can't support their partner or communicate with their partner, unfortunately, relationships break down, and that has an adverse reaction to the family and the child. So this is everybody's problem. We just need to learn to look at a family as the family is what it is. We don't individualize parents all the time. We unite them to give them the best tools, not to have all the answers, but to build a platform on what their parenting journey is going to look like.
Thank you so much, Scott. There's an awful lot that you've talked about in there, which honestly, I think if we had the time, we could take over 3 hours or even ages just dissecting and unpicking a lot of the things that you've said there. You've talked about dad's guilt, and also you mentioned about mom's guilt when you're going back to work, which is something that slowly we're starting to see a lot of men talking, kind of expressing that guilt. Sometimes it's not just about the separation anxiety or the separation guilt, but the guilt like, okay, I was really not there. I went back to work way too early. I'm not sure I've been the best dad, and things like that. And then, like you talked about, the pressure on the mothers remains, because it's in many ways, I think it's a kind of a cultural perception, because for a very long time, women are looked upon as that is your job. And in many ways, it's like from when you're born, you kind of are groomed to deal with things like that, or even at the point of having children, it's just like there because of societal influence. And even we still see a lot of workplaces, the model is still very much mothers, you are the primary caregivers, and fathers, you are the breadwinners. And this is causing a lot of problems. You touch on the hybrid aspect of it and the fact that it's giving parents, both mothers and fathers, now that opportunity to really engage and do much more. And I wondered whether, and because like you said, with your family, you've always homeschooled, but you are coaching people who are not who traditionally or normally are not homeschooling their children. So do you think with those people, the pressure was more or less or same like you had in your own family, Scott? What would you?
Yeah, there's pressures on every family. We were very fortunate, and when I speak to parents that had to homeschool during the pandemic, and they will say, I don't know why you do this through choice, Scott, I think you're crazy. You know, there'd be a lot of people, that's the sort of opinion, and we would talk about it in a sort of casual manner. But what they would say is that it's so much pressure. You know, I didn't do well in school, for example, is one that comes up quite a lot. I don't know this stuff. You know, I genuinely, and it causes a lot of anxiety and depression, and it embarrasses them in front of their children. And that was putting up barriers that probably weren't there before. On the other side, I know lots of people that they've got a different relationship with their child now because they've educated them and they've connected on a different level, and they've found different loves for things that they now do together. You know, they might have had a love for astrology they didn't know they had. You know, they might have a passion for history that they now look at things together. So there's lots that you can learn from teaching, without a shadow of a doubt. This is why most of us are here. But what I've definitely found is this, oh my God, I'm failing. It's this pressure, homeschooling so difficult. And what I've said is that they weren't necessarily homeschooling because it wasn't a choice. You know, what I did was a choice. I chose to do that long before COVID. They were surviving a pandemic and they weren't really given the tools to do it. And without blaming anybody or pointing fingers, but you know, to a degree, the education system let them down and it didn't give them enough support and it left them out to dry a little bit. And then what they've now done, and you're talking about guilt, a lot of the guilt I'm experiencing when talking to parents is this: now they've gone back into the school system, they're behind, they've got to catch up. You know, so you failed them, you're terrible. That's what that translates to a lot of parents. You know, you failed your child, they're going to be impacted forever, they're never going to go to university, never going to get a job. That's what a lot of parents are hearing. And I think that's very, very unfair. And I think there's lots of different ways we could have done it in terms of how we could have supported children. We didn't support their mental health anywhere near enough. And they went through the same pandemic as we did, and we didn't give them enough spaces to talk about what their experiences were and how their world was turned completely upside down, and they were supposed to be taught by their parents. And as a home educator, the one thing that we noticed was when I did it for the first time with my eldest, when you were trying to push that little bit extra. So if they were doing creative writing, for example, and they gave a very good answer, you know they've got a little bit more. You know you can just add a little bit more detail. You know, what was the weather like? You know, what was he wearing? You know, what facial expressions did he have? You're not a teacher trying to get that extra. You're a parent nagging. And that's a very difficult barrier to break down. So a lot of parents went through this, and there was change in the family, that the children were reacting differently to being in a home environment because they've never done it before. And nobody was given the tools on how to support these children through it. Some children that have a difficult time in school, like neurodiversity, this homeschool has been brilliant, and they've engaged with school on a level that they haven't done before because they've been in their own comfort, in their own zone, in a place where they feel happy, on a screen that they could maybe turn off if they need to. And they've engaged on a different level. And I think what we need to do moving forward for families and for students of all ages and all levels is we need to try and integrate that hybrid model on the same way, and stop looking at it that if you, for example, if somebody doesn't learn the way that you're teaching them, then you teach them the way that they learn. And I think that that's what homeschool happened, because a lot of parents didn't have the time to invest in doing it the way that the school would maybe do it. So they had to find creative ways. And that sparked a lot of love for education, you know, doing science experiments at home with your parents. You know, there's lots of kids that love that sort of thing. And it's something that will carry on outside of school. So dads are more involved in the after school activities and homework now because they were involved in the homeschool. You know, so it has changed the whole family dynamics. The problem is we've only got a certain window to keep hold of it and make that the norm before it's gone again and we go back to where we were. That's my biggest concern.
Thank you so much, Scott. And that is why we keep saying, what lessons have we learned from COVID, from the pandemic? Which ones are we keeping? Which ones are we going to get rid of? It's a big question. Thank you. And just turning to Gail now. So Gail, you've done research on parental leave policies in the UK and Sweden, and you're doing the big project we've talked about, which touches on many other countries. But what are the key suggestions you think that the US could benefit from implementing in their society or even in the government policies? And what kind of outcome would you predict it will produce in terms of gender or gender addressing the gender equality issue?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. And I think a lot of it builds on what Amy and Scott have been talking about in terms of Amy's talking about sort of this difference between policy and practice and the need for policy. And yet we're seeing so much in the US based on individual practice because it's each person or each couple or each family trying to figure it out themselves when so many people are dealing with the same issues. But because there's not that overarching policy available, you know, at the federal level, it's like, it feels like everyone's on their own to sort of work it out with their employer, which always leaves certain people out, particularly lower income folks. So I think that it's really important to, you know, look at what kind of policy can help, right? And I think this is something that I was working on before the pandemic, and in some ways it seems like, okay, parental leave is, you know, a very specific policy, and is it too niche, and is it relevant? You know, we're trying to figure out a pandemic, but I think it is so important for all of the things that we're talking about today, because it's so important to think about what kind of policy can really help individuals and families right at the start and really encourage more equal sharing of both work and family kinds of roles. So I think just from my experience in seeing what's happened in, say, the UK and Sweden, I think the UK is an example of having had a very lopsided parental leave policy. Just as a short background, up until, a few years ago, it was like a year of maternity leave and 1 or 2 weeks of paternity leave. So that's a big gap. And, it's not unreasonable to think that, okay, women are going to take maternity leave. They're going to do everything at home, take care of kids. Often the UK has a disproportionately high part-time employment rate for women, because a lot of mothers then feel like they can't do everything and they go back part-time to try to manage it all. But I think, with the introduction of first additional paternity leave and then shared parental leave, this is something that's still it's still attached to maternity leave. So there's still this idea that it's for mothers and not for fathers, right? So you really have to make the case that, that fathers should do this, and you don't have the support of, employers or society. They're just not sort of invested in this or used to this kind of idea. So I think the most important part of a parental leave policy would be that every parent has the same amount of leave, right? So whatever amount of leave it is, every parent should have that, right? And it should belong to that parent without being transferred to another parent. So Sweden is a case where they figured out, they were the first country to introduce parental leave, not just maternity or paternity, in 1974, right? So they're ahead. They've always been a bit ahead on gender equality, but they figured, fathers aren't actually taking it. And so they realized, we need to actually set aside time for fathers to take this leave. And it was called daddy's leave or the bonus month or different terms that were used. But it's basically, they've added a month and 2 months. Right now it's 3 months. So each parent gets 3 months and you can't, trade it. And then there's additional time. So you see Swedish fathers, they take the time, they take the 3 months, and it seems like a lot, especially over here in the US where we don't have any. But at the same time, and so, society has adapted, and workplaces realize, okay, fathers have to take, they are going to take leave. And so it's all quite normal. But at the same time, because the rest of the leave you can transfer, we still have a situation where mothers, even in Sweden, mothers are taking more leave than fathers, right? So I think the idea would be having the same amount of leave. And that's where I think the US, even though we don't have a paid policy at the federal level, what we've been seeing at the states is, individual entitlement. And so everyone has the same leave. So that's one positive that we have going. But I also think thinking about how much time is really important, because this is as Scott was saying, some of the fathers during the pandemic, who hadn't been as involved, now they're taking their kids places or doing homework with their kids and so forth. This is, parental leave sets that up right at the start, right? So fathers who take parental leave, we know that they're more involved, they stay involved. So this is really the time, if you want to make a big difference, to do it. And so it's important to do that. And I think it's important, it's clearly important for mothers and children, but for fathers as well, in terms of spending time with kids and mental health and so forth. And I think that's where the idea of how much leave is too much. That's sort of the other flip side, is that just in my research, it seems like about 6 months for each parent seems to be the sweet spot, because that's sort of when we can see differences in employment and potential career interruptions, in terms of mental health and, you know, being at home for too long. So those kinds of things. So thinking about the same amount of leave, if I were writing the policy, it would be 6 months, and obviously having it well paid. But yeah, I'll stop there for any follow-ups.
Thank you so much, Gail. I think you've said the key thing. It's about recognizing that parents are parents, mother or father, and they should have same amount of leave. Thank you. Sorry, Amy. So last question to you, Amy. So how have the disparities between parenthood bonus and maternity penalty has shaped the pandemic lockdown? So this is a question that picks on what Gail and Scott have been saying. So how do you think this has interacted with expectations for mothers versus fathers working from home and out of the pandemic now going forward?
The fatherhood bonus and the motherhood penalty. One of the things I just want to emphasize from what everyone has been saying is these inequities will not go away until we have an equal expectation of leave across genders. So this is, and as we think of it as parental leave often sounds like maternity leave. People just do the automatic switch of language in their head. So one way we've found that is more helpful is to talk about it as caregiving leave, to do that more broadly. And so bringing those terms in also helps me think about motherhood bonus and fatherhood sorry, that was a slip of what I would like. Motherhood penalty and a fatherhood bonus. So those are terms that people are pretty familiar with usually, but just to make sure that when you become a mother, you have penalties for it within your career. And when you become a father, there's a bonus. You usually have people see you as someone who is more likely to be reliable, need to work for money. They give you a bonus. They might give you a promotion, those kinds of things, where the mother becomes unreliable. But what further research has found on that is really that you can address it with that language piece I was talking about. So a motherhood or a fatherhood bonus was really a breadwinner bonus. It was really about like, okay, we can say, if I go in and I say, I'm the breadwinner in my family, that becomes a different conversation with the manager than if I'm the primary caregiver. You know, those are different conversations. So if we think about how we set that up, unfortunately, the motherhood penalty doesn't go away. That remains a caregiving penalty across the board. So don't go in and say you're the primary caregiver, go in and say you're the primary breadwinner. Those are some things that we've found important. And I'm not sure if that answered your question. So how has the pandemic interacted around that? I think Scott answered that so beautifully. It's just given us a moment in time where people got to try on different roles that they may not have had access to before. And this is what I love about the parental leave timeframe, that it's that moment in our lives when everything is chaotic and thrown up in the air, and we get to consciously choose, if we're supported well and given the space to be able to think and choose anything in our lives, to put those pieces back down in ways that really support our growing families. And that is the same, the pandemic's exactly the same. It was this moment of absolute chaos where all of the norms are thrown out the window. And for some families, they were able to put them back together in ways that really worked well. For some, they didn't. But that consciousness and awareness and presence that so many fathers were able to have during this time has just been really powerful to see. We work with a lot of clients who will never want to go back into the office again beyond a hybrid model. And the companies that don't keep up with it are going to lose them. I think you're on mute. Okay.
Thank you so much, Amy. Yes, you're right. There's a lot of lessons. I know the pandemic wasn't ideally what anybody would have loved, but there's an awful lot of lessons that can be taken from there. And thank you all for the discussion. I've just had a look at the Q&A and there's no question in there for us. So thank you so much for the discussion. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Scott, for being here. And thank you to everybody that joined us along the line. So thank you all so much. And to Gail and Amy, you still have your day ahead of you. So have a fantastic International Women's Day. To Scott and I, we will be retiring for the day, aren't we, Scott? So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
for having me. Take care. Lovely to meet you, ladies.
Nice to
Take
meet
care.
you. Bye.
Bye.